Hey guys, today I want to show you how to buy profitable rental properties that are putting money in your pocket from day one. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Param. I'm a radiologist in Southern California. I'm a mom. I'm a real estate investor with over 300 million in assets under management. And I've built a community, Generational Wealth MD, where I help physicians get to financial freedom using real estate. And we are over 20,000 physicians strong at this point. But in the last few years, I've spoken to so many physicians who've acquired properties where every month they are feeding those properties, right? So these are properties where they've used 15-year loan products. They may be properties in high cost of living areas where end of the day, after all their expenses, they're actually having to put capital into those properties and they're banking on appreciation or they're banking on cash flow 15 to 30 years later when they want to send a child to college. And this is one of the problems that happened in 07 and 08, where people were buying properties hoping that they would appreciate, not necessarily buying cash flowing properties when they acquired them. My hope for you is that you're always going to know to run numbers and you're always buying properties that are profitable, putting money in your pocket. And what I want to share with you today is a free calculator that I think all of you should be using, especially if you're buying your first few properties, right? Because when I bought my first property, I didn't know anything about how to run numbers for a rental property, right? I did not have a calculator that I used. I just knew PITI. And what PITI stands for is principal, interest, property taxes, and insurance. And all I knew was that and this is what I learned from my mentors, right? Which there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that it's not a very accurate strategy. What I learned is that as long as my rent was above PITI, I was fine. But the honest truth is that that is great. That's a great way to get started. But if you want to be more intentional about buying properties where you know end of the year that you're going to actually have capital in the bank, then I want you to use this calculator, this free calculator in the comments. Please type in calculator if you don't have access to it. We have two separate calculators, one for long-term rentals and one for short-term rentals. Short-term rentals, you calculate income and occupancy differently, and your expenses are also different. So you want to make sure you're being intentional about really clocking in everything that that you're spending on, so you know whether you're keeping capital in your pocket. With short-term rentals, you also want to stress test the numbers. So long-term rentals, if you're buying your first long-term rental, then definitely use this calculator that I'm going to share with you. It's a very easy way for you to make sure you're running numbers. You're buying a profitable property. Make sure you know all the expenses that you need to factor in. Like I said, when I started off, I didn't know how to factor in property management, HOA costs, or even, repairs and maintenance and vacancy. These were things that I did not even think about. And there is a way for you to make sure you're running all of these numbers accurately. So let me go ahead and share with you our calculator for long-term rentals that I want all of you to be using, especially if this is your, first property, even if it's the first property that you're being intentional about in terms of, am I running my numbers accurately? What I'm going to do in the interest of time is that I'm going to run numbers for a property that I acquired a few years ago locally in Bakersfield that I purchased for $360,000. I put 25% down, and closing costs are typically about 2 to 3%. Right now, this was actually a property where I went and I did a rehab myself. I did not have general contractors. I ran the crews myself. I sourced the material myself, and because I was very active in this property, I was able to shelter a few $100,000 of clinical income from taxes, which kind of boosted my returns. I took the property's rent from $2,300 to $3,000. So we'll talk a lot about these strategies, and we have separate rehab BRRRR calculators for any properties that you want to do rehabs on within our coaching program. That being said, if you're just starting out and you want a simple calculator every time to run numbers, you can even use this calculator if you have a multifamily property that's 4 units or under. This works. If you don't want to use the more complex multifamily calculators or BRRRR calculators. So let's just plug the numbers in and see what that looks like. And it gives you an example of, it takes away I'm hoping this takes away the fear from actually working with calculators and running numbers yourself, right? Okay, so closing costs are typically going to be about 2 to 3%. So let's say $7,000 in closing costs. Rehab costs A lot of you will probably not have a lot of expenses. Sometimes you may have mild cosmetic rehabs that you do as you acquire the property. So I'm going to say 15,000, which is close to what I spend on this property. I completely rehabbed the bathrooms, the kitchens, and I put hardwood flooring in most of the house. I, took away the tile and the carpets, and I put LVP in. So that's what it cost. And this was a beautiful 3-bedroom property, single family home in a very nice neighborhood. And so if you know what you're doing, you can always do this more efficiently. That's where the education part comes in. Interest rates, we're going to bump this up to 6%, just because, you may not always get the interest rates we've had in the past. And so we want to keep this more realistic. Loan length in years, that's pretty self-explanatory. Property tax rate, you're going to drop that in here. Annual insurance premium. So this is annually what you're paying for insurance for the property, monthly rent that you're getting on the property. That is, again, when you're looking for property prices, you're finding this on Zillow, your property manager has it, it's on the listing. When you go to monthly rents, question often is, where do I get that data from? If you're working with an investor agent, which is why I highly recommend, which is why even within the coaching program, our goal is to connect all our students with vetted agents in the markets that we work in, multiple markets throughout the country for long-term and short-term rentals. But if you are working with an investor agent, they can give you rent comp data. So they will be able to give you within the last 6 months in the same school district, in this zip code, right? And you want to make sure, the same zip code can have different school districts. So you want to make sure it's, all the parameters are essentially similar to your property. What were rents like? What did properties rent for? How long were they on the market? They can give you rent comp data. You can also get rent comp data from Zillow and Rentometer, two other places where you can source this data. What I've noticed recently is that Rentometer and Zillow is undervaluing rents in many markets that I invest in. So I always say rent comp data from your rent comparison data from your property manager is probably the best thing, which is why it's important to work with the right people, right? So that's where you plug in your monthly rent. Now, vacancy and maintenance. Vacancy for long-term rentals is typically 5%, which means that you have on average someone who comes and stays in your properties for 2 years, right? A 5% vacancy rate means that every 2 years you have turnover and you have a month where you have a vacant unit, which is pretty reasonable. My turnover is usually 2 to 5 years. And so 5% is a very conservative number, right? Maintenance, if you have an older property, you're probably going to plug in 10% for maintenance. If you have a newer property, that's probably going to be 5%. If you have a rehabbed property where you've completely rehabbed everything, all of your hardware, all of your bathrooms, your roof is replaced. You don't have any, your HVAC, your water heater, your roof, like I said, and you don't have any foundation issues, and a lot of things have been replaced. You can go down to 5% when all of that work is done. So for this particular property, because I did have some work done on the roof, and I did have, I did rehab the property, I'm going to plug in well, actually, I did 15%. So that's pretty average for an older property. 10% for maintenance and 5% for vacancy. We're plugging that in. What is your property management fee? This particular property I was self-managing, so we're going to leave it at 0%. If you do have property management, that's typically 5 to 10%. It can go up to 15% for a long-term rental. Again, those numbers are going to be very different for a short-term rental, but for a long-term rental, 5 to 10% is where you will land. Monthly HOA in this case was about $35 at the time of acquisition. I was not paying for utilities, the tenants were, and so I'm going to leave it at that. Now, remember, when I acquired this property, interest rates were much lower, but we're plugging in numbers for a higher interest rate. So now let's take a look at what the calculator is spitting out for us, right? So over here, it's giving you the loan amount. This is your actual loan amount. The rest of it is your down payment. Your initial cash investment includes your down payment and your closing costs as well as rehab costs, right? And so when you're running numbers like, what is my cash on cash return, which means this is my initial investment, this is how much capital I have in the property, right? This is what I used to acquire the property. When you're running your cash on cash returns, which is for this, considering that this is how much I invested, what is my ROI in terms of cash flow that hits my bank account every month? In this case, it's 5%, right? It's 5%. Now, remember, this number is lower because we acquired the property and we are plugging in higher interest rates, and this is your monthly cash flow from the property, right? This is your monthly principal and interest payment. this is in the first few years, obviously, of acquisition. The numbers will, it stays pretty standard if you have a 30-year fixed loan. These are your expenses, and this is what you end up with. Now, what I want you to remember is that as you go in, you want to have a property where you're breaking even in some cases, or at least cash flow positive, right? This is a pretty decent number in the current environment. Getting 5% cash on cash return is actually pretty good. So I'm happy with these numbers. What you also have to remember is that cash flow is only a part of your returns. Apart from this, you're probably getting about 6% ROI, 5% from cash flow, which is your cash on cash return, right? So 5% ROI from cash flow, typically getting about 6% from debt pay down, where you're paying your mortgage, right? That's considered an expense, but that is going towards equity you have in the property. So you have another 6% there. And then we have typically about 12% ROI coming in from property appreciation because we are using a loan on this property, right? So typically properties appreciate by 3% annually. That's inflation correlated. But because we are only putting 25% down, you multiply that by 4. That's your leverage multiplier. So you're using leverage to increase your ROI. So as the property value increases by $3,000, your ROI is not just that 3,000 because your initial investment is lower. Your ROI is actually 12%. And if this is confusing, we're going to talk about this in depth during the 3-day event. But for now, just remember that on average, you get about 5%. I mean, you can be anywhere from 0 to 10% ROI from cash flow in a long-term rental. And then you also have debt pay down. You also have, property in appreciation that you factor in. It's typically about 12% if you have a loan on the property. That's 12% ROI, historically speaking, that you get from appreciation, and then tax savings if you're able to tap into that. So multiple ways, but this is how this is a very clear, very intentional way of knowing, factoring in everything, including vacancy and maintenance. Do I have a property that is cash flow, that's cash flow positive end of the day? Am I feeding the property, or is the property putting cash into my pocket? I hope this was super helpful. Again, if you're looking for the free calculator, type in the comments, say calculator. If you're looking for the short-term rental calculator, say STR calculator, or just type calculator, and we'll send you the long-term rental calculator. But this is a free resource. This is amazing because you can use this on the go. I love using this on my phone, and it really helps you figure out if the property that you're purchasing is profitable and it's putting money in your pocket. So yeah. So again, in the comments, if you're looking for that calculator, type in calculator and we'll send this your way.